Use Photoshop other than drawing on Barack Obama's face? A little bit? A little bit. So we're going to use Photoshop just minimally, and we're going to use it to make the measurements that we need of the different facial features, and to actually plan out our drawing, or to do our drawing to plan out our modeling of the skull. So on your computer you should have Photoshop, which you can just search for in Spotlight, but it should be under Applications, Adobe, Photoshop CS6, or I think you have CS6 on here. And we can just open that up. So in the past, what we've done, and what I've done when I draw this by hand, is I render out these images and I put them side by side so they're calibrated, so I can take a ruler and draw across from one to the other. So for example, if in the side view I establish where the nose tip is, then I can take a line across to the front view and line up the nose tip there. So that's exactly what we want to do here in Photoshop, but Photoshop makes it a little bit easier for us because it allows us to overlay one drawing right on top of another and add more layers on top of those too. So I'm going to open up those two images that I just created in Photoshop. So I'll just select both of them and open them up. So this opens them as two separate files, and I'm just dragging these little tabs down so they are opened up in separate windows. And I want to bring them into a single file. So we're going to create a new file in Photoshop. Go to File, New, and we want to make it the same size, which is 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels. And we can call this whatever is suitable, skull images. And it creates a new tab. I'll just drag that off. So you can see I've got an empty file here. So when we're working in Photoshop, the two most important palettes that we need open are the Layers palette, which we saw once before when we were doing the Obama thing, and the toolbar here, which shows us all the different tools we have access to. If you don't see these, you can always go into Window and choose the Layers palette, and down here the Tools palette. We need one other palette open, which is the Channel box. So Channels here, we'll click on to open that up. So the way any kind of digital imaging software works, oh my hand, is that this is a different one. It records the color information in an image. By default, it records it as RGB, red, green, and blue. And then it records an alpha channel if you've asked it to. That's why we chose to save it as a TIFF file. And you can see here that this is a black and white representation of our image. Black where there should be transparency, and white where we want the color to show through. So if you think of it as a piece of acetate with a painting on it, the painting is the color, the acetate where you can see through is the black part of the alpha. So we want to drag these images we've created into our new file. But we don't want to drag all this white information from the background. So I'm just going to use my selection arrow up here. And if I command click on the alpha channel here, so I'm in this view of the skull, and you can see that there's this little selection line going all the way around my skull now. And with this arrow selected, I can grab my skull and drag it over into this new file. And if I hold down Shift, it will lock it to the middle of that image. And then we'll do the same thing with the side view. Sometimes these things get turned around. So I don't need this one anymore. I'm going to close it. This is the new file I've created. And you'll notice that in this new one I've created, it's placed that one skull on its own layer above the background. And it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a checkerboard behind here, which means that that area is transparent. So if I place something behind it, I'll be able to see it. So I'll do the same thing with this side view. Again, going into the channel box, command clicking on the alpha channel. We get the selection around all the colored elements in our image. I'm going to drag it over and hold down Shift, and it should put it right on top. I don't need this image anymore. So now, and I don't need the channels anymore, I just need my layers palette and the image. Oh, ow. So you can see here we've got the background, we've got the first layer, we've got the second layer, and I'm going to name these front and side. And it looks to me like everything is pretty well lined up, but we just want to double check and make sure everything is the same. You can see in my view here, I've got these rulers in the periphery of this window, and I can use these to measure things in the scene. If you don't see these in yours, you can hit Command R to turn them on and off. It's under View for rulers here. And we want to make sure we're set to the right units as well. So if we right click in here, we either want millimeters or centimeters. I think we're dealing in, we want millimeters. So, and if we want to make measurements here, we can click in the ruler and drag down. It will pull out a guide. So you can see it's pulling out a line here. And when I get close to one of my images, it snaps there. And it leaves this line as a guide so I can make sure my two images are lined up exactly to that same line. If I drag another guide down there, I can see that the bottom of the chin on both is lined up perfectly. If I drag one of these skulls over, I can also pull one down to see if Rhinion is in the same position, which it is. Drag down another one for the anterior nasal spine. So I can see that the renders are exactly the same size, which is good, which is what I need. So the next thing I need to do is to make sure that this little cube is actually 1 centimeter in this world. So what I can do to assess this is to draw a couple of guides that are exactly 1 centimeter apart. If I zoom in a little bit, I'm just holding down Option and zooming in. Remember, this is in millimeters, so this is a 10 millimeters, so this is a 1 centimeter measure. We know that our little cube is exactly 1 centimeter in Maya units. So if I drag a guide over, say here to 90, and drag another one over to 100, I know I've got an exactly 1 centimeter measure here. It's a little difficult to see on the screen, I'm sorry. If I want to move around my scene, the best way to do it is to open up another palette, the window called Navigator. And you can see it shows a representation of my image, so if I'm zoomed in, I can still move around. And I can use these little buttons down at the bottom to zoom in or to zoom out. So I want to take these two layers and scale them such that this cube here will fit exactly between these two guides that I have. Now before I do anything else, I'm just going to move them over to see if it actually fits already. It might be pretty close. We're lucky. So I'm moving both layers because I selected both of them here in the layers palette. And it's actually not bad. I think my 100 line could come over a little bit. But you can see it's not quite right. This cube is a little bit too big. So the last thing we have to do is to shrink down both of these images at the same time so they match. So to do this with both of these selected, I can either go to Edit and Free Transform, or I can use the shortcut, which is Command T. And it will open up this bounding box around both of these, and I can shrink them down a little bit by grabbing the corner and starting to drag in, and then holding down Shift to lock it to a uniform scale. And I'm moving this box back in here, just zooming in a little bit. So that's pretty good. And just hit return to complete the action. So now what I have are these. If I want to clear my guides, I can just go to View, Clear Guides. So now I've got these two images, and I'm moving them both together because they're both selected here in the Layers panel, that are calibrated to be real-world size. So I know that if I make a measurement of 1 centimeter with that ruler, it will actually be 1 centimeter in anatomical size too. So that will allow us to know that our tissue depth markers, which we scaled in Maya, are actually real-world units in here, and any measurements we make of the nose and the mouth and so on can be made in real measurements. Okay? I know it's a lot of stuff to go over, lots of buttons to push, things to move around, but you can review the video to watch this. Let me just go on for a few more minutes and we'll take another break. I want to show you first how to start doing some of the measurements, and we'll do the nose last because it's the most complicated. One thing I didn't do in here actually was put the eyeballs in. The eyeballs also have to be in place before you do this rendering stage. So now that these are both placed and you want to center them as much as possible as you can in the middle of your image here, we want to start making the measurements that we know how to make from our readings. So for example, if we want to do the measure of the mouth, we have to start to make these measurements in Maya. Now there are a couple of ways that we can do this. And we can drag guides out to find the edge of the canine here. We're missing part of the canine here, so we've got central incisor, lateral incisor is missing, the root of the canine is here. So we just have to estimate roughly where the edge of that canine is. So we have to make a measurement here to figure out how wide the mouth should be. Now we know that the way we do this is to measure this distance and then multiply it by 1.33, as we discussed last week, and that will give us chalion to chalion, which are the corners of the mouth. We also know that the meeting level of the lips should be just above the incisal edge of the central upper incisors, so we can estimate it somewhere like that. We can take a measure of a couple of millimeters if we want to. So how do we make a measurement here? Well, in Photoshop, there's this thing called the measure tool, or the ruler tool, happily. And you might not see it in your toolbar right away because it's hidden underneath this eyedropper. So if we hold down this button, we can find the ruler tool here. And we can take a measure of this here, but it's not telling us anything yet. It's giving us a length of 93.04, but 93.04 what? We haven't told, well in this case it's going to give us the exact millimeters. So this would, that doesn't make sense. That's also 10 centimeters. So we have to tell Photoshop first what the units are that we're using. And that's where our cube comes in again. So we have to go in and tell Photoshop that this is 1 centimeter here. So if we go to Image and Analysis, we want to set the measurement scale by Custom. And so it says pixel length and logical length. And the logical units, and we'll say, is centimeter. And then if we use our ruler tool to drag from one side to the other, holding down Shift, it will say 30 pixels equals 1 centimeter in this case. So now if we want to start making some measurements, Photoshop will know what these measurements mean in real-world units. So here in Photoshop we can use this thing in the window called the measurement log. And it will open up a little window at the bottom here. I just drag this up. And now if I do a measurement from this edge to this edge and record the measurement, it's going to give me a length here. Sorry, I've got too many windows open. So I made the measurement and then said record measurements. And you can see that it gives me a measurement of 3.1. And we told them already that's centimeters, so that seems to make sense, about 3 centimeters for the width. And so we could take this value and multiply it by 1.33. So it's about more than that. So if you do that multiplication, then you can figure out what that length is and then set the guides in Photoshop to reflect that extra bit. So we can say that if it has to be an extra 5 millimeters on each side, you can drag a guide over that's 5 millimeters over from this guide. You can drag another one over that's 5 millimeters from that guide, and that will give you the position of the corner of the mouth. And we know the position according to the incisal edge of the upper incisor. And then we want to start recording these things on new layers. So what I want you to do when you're doing this is to create a layer in the layers palette. We're going to call this measurements. And then we can start drawing on this layer to record some of these things. And for this, just like in the Obama exercise, we're going to use our paintbrush and our painting tools. And use the square brackets to make this a little smaller, or just open up this to change the size of our brush. We just want to rough in where the mouth is going to be. So we have a measure and position for the meeting angle, or the meeting edge of the lips, and the width of the mouth through these measurements. Now, for us, doing lip thickness is going to be more difficult because we don't have the enamel height at the top here. So you're going to have to wing it a little bit and just do a rough measurement of what you think the enamel height might be. You can see it a little more clearly on the lower tooth. But again, using the same tools in Maya, you can take these measurements and then run them through those regression equations for doing lip thickness that we talked about last week. Similarly, when you have the eye in here, let's say we have, if I didn't forget to put the eye in, you're going to have the eye sort of roughly like this. Sabrina talked about how to position the eye centrally, slightly lateral, slightly up. Protruding, it's going to be a tangent from superior to inferior orbital margin. It's going to cut through the cornea, not as far as the iris, not as far out as the leading edge of the cornea. But then we have to figure out how to draw the eyelids. You can see here this bony ridge. This is the anterior lacrimal crest, and this is where the the medial palpebral ligament inserts. So we can use that to give us some sort of idea of where the medial canthus is. And it's hard to see on here, and by hard I mean impossible, but there's also a little tubercle in here called the malar tubercle, which is where the lateral palpebral ligament inserts. I'll bring in the skull next time for when you get to the stage and we can look at it a little more closely, but you're going to want to draw a line that goes from one to the other and just cuts over the iris slightly. You don't want the eye to be open wide enough so you see any white over the iris. That will look like the person is surprised. And the lower one will go similarly from the malar tubercle across and down to the anterior lacrimal crest. So I'm just roughing it in here. We'll look at it a little more closely later on, but then we get generally the shape of the eye like that. There's also, you'll have to look at some examples, and I'll put a series of sample images of faces you can look at where you can see how the lateral canthus and the medial canthus will look, but this will give you a way to plan out how the eyelids will be positioned here in the eye. And once you've done this, you might want to, or you will want to, use guides to identify where you've placed the medial or the upper and lower eyelids. So then when you have this image open, the other view, you can use these as guides for placing them here. So, for example, if I have another layer here that I can draw in if I had the eyeball in place, again. So, ooh, weird eyeball. So if it's something like that, I know that the eyelids are going to come something like this to match up to the other view that I have. You also have all your tissue depth markers here. So for example, if you have nasion coming out here, you can draw an outline that will follow nasion, and then find rhinion and follow that to give you the general shape of the face here. Okay, we've gone over a lot of stuff. Let me stop here.